Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters. As we speak, Israel and Hamas are about to implement a deal that will see the release of some 50 hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. But then we're told the conflict will continue. Where is all this heading? Israel has said it wants to destroy Hamas. Is that really possible? And what's the future for both Israelis and Palestinians after this? It's clear that their politics will be radically altered. We're joined by Dahlia Scheindlin, a political analyst and political scientist based in Tel Aviv. And I'm sure many people watching will know she's a frequent contributor to our study tours. Hello and welcome, Dahlia.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us. It's appalling. I mean, I've had some sleepless nights. I'm sure you have. You know far more people than I do in the region, and I'm sure you've lost friends as well who were killed during the appalling events of October the 7th. So it's truly horrendous. It is difficult to know where to start, and I'm interested really to focus on Israeli public opinion, to know how that might shape this conflict, and also look at longer-term considerations. So, what's happening within Palestinian politics. But just to start with, Dahlia, do you get an idea of what the Israeli government's trying to achieve? I mean, they said they want to destroy Hamas, but beyond that, what do they want?
That's a good question. I mean, they haven't given us much of an indication of what they want. The goals have been defined as destroying Hamas's military and governing capacity. Sorry, I'm getting a strange message here. The goals have been defined as destroying Hamas's military and governing capacity, returning the hostages. And in addition to that, Israel has made statements about, cutting off responsibility for Hamas for Gaza once and for all, by contrast to this kind of ongoing relationship of Israel maintaining a closure over Gaza effectively since 2005. And none of those, other than the hostages, are particularly well defined. The hostages are a very clear barometer. As you pointed out, we have this deal coming into effect whereby, if all goes well, 50 tomorrow at 10 o'clock, a ceasefire will go into effect, and each day a certain number will be released until there are 50. We are told that 30 of those will be children, 20 of them will be women, 12 of those are supposed to be the mothers of the children who are being released, and then there will be a ceasefire for about 4 or 5 days. But in terms of destroying Hamas's military and governing capacity, I don't think there's a real measure for that. Or if there is, and there may well be, one that the government is not sharing. And therefore, it's very hard to know if there's going to be an end date to the active fighting. I mean, one would think there has to be some sort of an end date to the most active phase of this war. But if Israel reoccupies, or, we might want to tighten up that language, since in effect Israel has had control over Gaza, well, for decades, but particularly since 2005. We could say, re-enter or maintain its security forces within Gaza for an indeterminate period of time, which is something the prime minister has said he might do. That could go on for years. I'll just remind people that Israel went to war in Lebanon in 1982 and had a widespread withdrawal, a large-scale withdrawal by 1984, but then essentially maintained an occupation of a security zone in southern Lebanon through the year 2000 for 18 years. And so all of those are possibilities. Of course, the further and far extreme right-wing flank of the government is also talking about completely reoccupying Gaza and rebuilding Israeli settlements there, which were dismantled once and for all in 2005. So that would be a very extreme approach to what to do in Gaza. I would say that's less likely, but there are also calls in Israeli society, again, from the very far religious right, to expel Palestinians entirely. Most people don't take those seriously. There was a document that came out of a particular ministry in Israel, but the ministry is one that has very little power and is a bit of a fiction that was kind of invented in order to have a portfolio. But nevertheless, all of these ideas are in the public discourse. That's the point I'm trying to make. And so when you ask what is Israel's aim, because we don't have clarity about what it really means to destroy Hamas's military and governing capacity, and because all of this full range of ideas, some more or less extreme, are out there, I would say it's extremely unpredictable. And I could try to say which one I think is most likely, but I think all bets are off in terms of what Israel is actually trying to achieve. As for the idea of Israel cutting responsibility for Gaza, which is something that the defense minister had said in the first couple of weeks of the war, I think it's important for people to realize that that is not possible. You can't take a scissors and snip it off the geographical map. So there is no such thing as completely, as Israel having nothing to do with Gaza, considering you have a population of 2 million people in a very densely populated area that is, integral to the geographic region where Israel exists. And therefore, there are too many overlapping factors. The economy is always going to be somewhat overlapping and interdependent. The environmental factors, the epidemiological and health factors are always going to be overlapping. Resources, water distribution, sewage treatment, all of that stuff cannot be disconnected. And so I know this isn't bringing terrible clarity to the question of what the Israeli government wants, but I'm trying to measure what they've said against what I think are the realistic possibilities.
Okay, great answer. Thank you, Dahlia. I've turned off my video because the bandwidth here is not so great, and it was struggling with it. So if you forgive me, you're just going to have that big sign up in front of my face instead. So has public opinion shifted? I mean, obviously there was sheer shock and horror at what happened on October the 7th, and a sense that something had to be done, Hamas had to be dealt with. But here we are, 14,000 dead. Does that matter? Does that have an impact on Israeli public opinion? And have other things shifted in terms of, I suppose, the negotiation of the hostages must be another key element?
Yeah, I mean, public opinion is a strange thing to think about when you ask, to try to understand what happened on October 7th. There is no public opinion. I mean, it's unjustifiable in any means that you can think about it, legal, political, moral, to attack civilians. It's never mind, massive breach of international law, but just human decency. So we don't need to ask about public opinion about what happened on October 7th. But I think that what we did see right away in public opinion, and this was from the very first weeks when, Israelis love polling themselves. So within a couple of weeks, we had surveys coming out. And the first thing that happened was a dramatic plunge in support for the Israeli government. And over time, that trend only deepened. So it's been, we're in the 7th week of the war now. And I can say that the biggest and clearest and most consistent change in public opinion is that the trust in the government, when measured, this is a tracking question that's measured over years. How much do you trust the Israeli government? That's down to a historic low of 18%, according to the Israel Democracy Institute. They say that's the lowest time they've had. That's the lowest number in 20 years. And the ruling party, the Likud, run by Mr. Netanyahu, is currently getting an average of about 17 or 18 seats, parliamentary seats, that is, in all surveys. Now, in the elections that just were held in November of 2022, that party won 32 seats. So it's losing, a very significant, about 40 or 45% of its strength. The coalition of parties led by Mr. Netanyahu, which currently holds 64 out of 120 parliamentary seats, it has a 64-seat majority. In all polls, very consistently is down to 42 or 43 seats. So not only have they lost their majority, that wasn't terribly new. They lost the majority in polling already before October 7th. But at this point, they've lost a third of their support. And Mr. Netanyahu himself is seeing ratings that are lower than any time I recall in the last, decade and a half, certainly since he's been prime minister again in 2009. So I would say that is the most consistent trend. Other specific issues, like, for example, the extent to which you were asking about civilian casualties and the extent to which the Israeli public thinks that the IDF should be concerned about civilian casualties. We do have polling on this. And what's interesting is that polling broke down somewhat evenly. There was about nearly 50% who think combined that Israel should very much take care to protect, civilian to avoid civilian casualties. And I say combined, I mean, some people said very much and some people said somewhat, but there was just a very slight majority who said that should not be Israel's concern in this war. But those are sort of one-off surveys. In other words, we don't have this ongoing tracking on these issues because they're so new. So we don't really know if they're changing over time. What we do know, for example, is that there have been a couple of surveys trying to test whether people support a hostage deal to release the Israeli civilian hostages being held. There are also soldiers being held. But I think that I don't want to distinguish when I'm talking on behalf of the Israeli public, because the Israeli public wants all of them released, civilians and soldiers alike, of course. But I think that from the perspective of looking at this from a situation of conflict analysis and international law, the civilians are certainly the most urgent and the clearest violation of any international convention. And in that sense, when you ask Israelis about whether there should be a deal to release the civilian hostages or the hostages, certainly a majority support it. Last poll I saw on this was over a week ago now, and it said about 60% support having a ceasefire in order to release hostages. So those are also certain elements that are being tested regularly. And in general, whenever a ceasefire is tested in surveys, it's always put in terms of some sort of a hostage release. So that is, it does win a majority of support, but it's a very, very tortured decision that people have to make, because Israel has, of course, been through this numerous times before, and Israel is well aware that the precedent of releasing Palestinian prisoners, many of them security prisoners, in return for hostages. And the last time we did this was not that long ago. It was in 2011, when over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners were released for a single Israeli soldier being held hostage. That often means, encouraging militant groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad to take further prisoners in the future. And many people feel this very materially. They say, well, you're condemning future hostages who are going to be kidnapped. They also involve the release of people who have then gone on to commit attacks. And so that has happened in the past. We've had, particular examples, like one important Hamas leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, was released in this kind of a hostage deal years ago. He's since been assassinated by the Israelis during the Second Intifada. And so all of these things are part of the very, very, profound dilemma that Israelis face on that issue. But I would still say the desperation, especially to release civilian hostages, is so huge that we have, I think, clear indication of a majority who support that. Those are the biggest trends I would say I see so far in public opinion. And whether it's changing or not, in a longer term sense, I would say that the measure that I'm keeping my eye on is whether Israelis are moving further to the right. Because usually when there are wars that involve significant attacks on Israeli civilians, Israelis do move further to the right in terms of just how they define themselves, right, left, or center, and in terms of the positions behind those definitions. And so far, we don't really have enough surveys that are showing that question to know, but the ones that we do have so far only show very minimal change, certainly in the rightward direction, and a reduction of the number of people who identify as left-wing, but it's very small, and it's still within the margin of error relative to before October 7th. It's just that that's my theory based on historic precedent, that we're likely to see that kind of change, in the next phase, whether it's a few months or a few years.
The bigger question is what happens to Gaza and the relationship with the Palestinians. But while focusing on Israeli politics, there's clear, as you said, clear anger with Netanyahu. Are his days numbered? I mean, and what influences that? What are the things that that affect that? Is it within the parliament, public opinion, his allies, his political allies, and this new coalition government brought about by the conflict?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that will affect it is what happens with his allies, really, because yes, public opinion is abysmal for him right now, but in truth, it was bad for him throughout the course of this year. His numbers were declining, his government, in polls, again, the numbers were declining there too. They had already lost their majority in polls. They were down to as low as, let's say, 52 to 54 seats out of 120. So they had already lost the majority in polling, as I mentioned before. And his personal ratings were already slipping. He had slipped behind some of the major contenders before October 7th. And of course, the country saw unprecedented turmoil. We had, we've overused the term unprecedented, but it was honestly an extraordinary thing to see nearly 40 weeks. October 7th would have been the 40th week of protests, of mass numbers of Israelis on the streets protesting against his government because of the reforms that they wanted to make to undercut the independence of the Israeli judiciary. And all of that was significant, but it didn't topple the government. And so, the public opinion now, I think people here are speculating, maybe out of hope, that it will topple the government. But I still think that in this kind of in our system, which is a strange sort of hybrid democracy and non-democracy, you still can't topple a government just with public opinion. I mean, there are sort of precedents, but it's. I think we're in a difficult.
Anger at the government for failing to see this coming. There's a huge desire for an inquiry to take place and the people to be held account, and Netanyahu foremost among those people. But
that would take a very long time. And we also don't know what kind of investigating committee would be established. This government being what it is, they might not establish an independent investigating committee, what we call a national investigating committee. They could very well establish what's called a government investigating committee. And in that case, it would basically be a bunch of loyalists who would probably not actually hold the government responsible in ways that would require them to resign. So in that, if there's no resignation or end of days for Netanyahu politically based on public opinion, what are the other options? One is the classic parliamentary mechanism of 5 defectors from Netanyahu's original government who because the government had 64 before it went into this expanded war coalition, assuming that after the active fighting is over, the war cabinet breaks down and he's left with 64 once again. 5 defectors who join a vote of no confidence could call new elections. That could happen. But that goes back to what I said, what you proposed before, which is that his own allies would have to turn against him, people who have remained, really slavishly loyal over the course of the year. And I would say the third option is coalition instability for other reasons. I'll give you one example. Last night, when the security, first the war cabinet met, then the security cabinet, and then finally the government had to approve this the deal that was negotiated for the release of these hostages. And there were 2 parties who said they wouldn't approve it, and together they hold 14 seats in the current Knesset, and they are key members of the governing coalition. And those are the very extreme right, messianic, theocratic, illiberal, Jewish supremacist parties of religious Zionism and Jewish power, Otzma Yehudit. They said, we're not going to approve this. We think it's bad. We think it's endangering Israeli security. We think it's immoral because it involves the release of some hostages and not all of them. And I think it was an incredibly, really remarkably out of step approach with relation to where the Israeli public is. But that was their position. And they even threatened that there was a possibility of them leaving the coalition. If that were to happen, it could create an interesting situation. It would be such a shakeup that perhaps the war cabinet, which involves an additional and important centrist right-wing party, sort of a pragmatic right-wing party, led by former Chief of Staff Benny Gantz, I thought, wow, maybe there could be a complete coalition shakeup and a new coalition that does not involve those extremist right-wing parties. Because of the war and the extraordinary circumstances, maybe the pragmatic right-wing coalition would agree to stay after the active fighting is over and they were supposed to have broken up that special war cabinet. Maybe they would come to some sort of a deal that if Netanyahu would not be prime minister, they would continue governing somehow. But that's all very theoretical and it seems pretty remote. Again, all of this is still speculation. Okay. In general, in Israel, we accept there's going to be surprises politically, but more so now than ever.
Okay, let's come back to Gaza and then in terms of what happens to both the Gaza Strip, but also to the sort of Palestinian leadership and governance. I mean, first of all, I suppose the main point to make is that northern Gaza already has between 40 and 50% of buildings damaged or destroyed. There's no electricity for sanitation, water's running out, flowers run out. So the humanitarian situation is pretty disastrous. But even then, if you look at it in the medium term, the infrastructure there is completely destroyed. So do you get any hint of what the possibilities are for what happens once this conflict is over? Or as you say, this could just go on for months or years?
Well, I mean, nobody's giving any hints. I mean, the Israeli government occasionally says something like, we will maintain a security presence for the foreseeable future. But that's not satisfying because it doesn't lead to any sort of understanding of who governs. Okay, who is going to govern the people? Unless you believe that there is an actual plan for total expulsion, which, as much as I want to think, I mean, it's hard for me to accept this emotionally. And I should say that even as an analyst, everybody in the country is having a hard time managing or separating our emotions from everything else. And, even as an analyst, that's not always easy to separate. And I don't want to believe that there is such a thing as an expulsion plan. But not only was it leaked from this semi-fictional government ministry, it was the lead editorial in one of the right-wing papers, and a fairly mainstream right-wing religious newspaper. Yes, to expel them from Gaza. So I don't want to believe that that's a reality, but I do think we have to accept that it is one of the scenarios that's out there when we think about what comes next, because what comes next can only be discussed if we know who's there. Is it the Palestinian people, or is it some sort of territory that's been emptied of most of its people with just some residual communities left? Assuming that there is no such thing as an actual possibility of full-out expulsion, at present, the majority of Gazans, about 1 million people or just under 1 million people, have been essentially herded into the southern part of Gaza. And there is a plausible scenario in which all of the top leadership is essentially destroyed in terms of governing capacity, which is what the government wants, and demilitarized. And then who governs them? Well, demilitarized, that would be in the best case scenario, but it could very well be that there's no coherent political leadership anymore because Israel has managed to destroy Hamas in terms of governance, and that population is simply left with no viable political leadership, no viable infrastructure or economy or economic opportunity because they're all, displaced. And so many of the simply residential structures have been destroyed all around the Strip. I mean, yes, the heaviest damage is in the north, but, just last night there was bombing all throughout Gaza. And if that happens, you're going to have essentially a wretched of the earth population with no particular governing leadership, probably not completely disarmed, which is, I think, another, very far-reaching and rather ambitious aim that we seem to skip over. The idea that you can completely disarm Gaza, that's a lot, right? There's a lot of weapons in Gaza, as we see, because they're, the militias there are still able to fire rockets into most parts of Israel or, central Israel. And then in that case, the people will be served by some sort of, phalanx of international humanitarian organizations. There'll be complete dependence festering in some sort of what other analysts have called a super camp. And that's hard to imagine as a viable scenario as well. What you'll see are competing militias who are running the place like gangs, because there's some sort of leadership always grows out of a vacuum, but it will be a militarized competition among ragtag gangs that, I call it the Mogadishu scenario. And then the only other scenario that I can imagine, the other scenarios that have been discussed is the possibility of reintroducing the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority is roundly reviled by Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. And that's partly because they are essentially becoming increasingly authoritarian. They haven't been elected since 2006, just like Hamas, by the way. And they govern with not only a strong hand, but very much in cooperation with Israel. They would be seen as a puppet government installed by Israel if they were to come back to Gaza now. They don't seem to want to do it. And Palestinians certainly don't want them to do it. And so that seems to me a completely unrealistic scenario, no matter how much the American president talks about it. And so if the American president, if the American administration decides that the only viable path is to have the Palestinian Authority, it will have to be something significantly reconstituted, maybe starting with the basic institutions such as they are, right? They're not in great shape, but it will have to be reconstituted. There will have to be different people. I'm not even sure how to start with that. And the only way I think that is viable to move ahead personally, and I've written about this, is to have some sort of international involvement, but it has to be a very significantly defined kind of international involvement. I don't think, I think there's two ways of looking at this broadly. One is completely wrong, and that is the idea that there can be some sort of single international force that will pick up the mess, clean up the mess, like an Arab peacekeeping force, which has been rejected already by Jordan, for example, because they don't want to be stuck with this, festering mess of Gaza. Or like, let's have the Arab countries clean it up and just deal with it militarily. You can't foist the problem off like that. And that is a completely wrongful way to look at international intervention. Another wrongful way to look at international intervention would be to say, let's impose some kind of Western state building project on the Palestinians or on Gaza. But I do think there is a more constructive way to look at international intervention. And that is a combination of Western and Middle Eastern countries working in cooperation together and with Israel and with the Palestinian leadership in a way that provides two prongs, both a security prong and a governance prong. And the governance side of that, and this is the most important part of all, is not about imposing an external government or trying to force even, a Western liberal democratic system on the Palestinians. As much as I wish that for them, I can't decide for them what kind of governance they want. But the main focus would be to provide the security piece necessary for Palestinians to put themselves in the position of being self-governing with the infrastructural and technical and knowledge support of the international community to a point where they can choose their own representatives, whether it's elections down the line or whatever form they decide, a constituent assembly or something. But the idea is that it's aimed at a focused process for transitioning to local leadership, to Palestinian leadership. Enough of outsiders trying to determine the fate of Palestinians, particularly Israelis, have lost that right, just as Palestinians have frankly lost the right to be governed by Hamas. in any significant sense, and certainly in a military sense, because it's too threatening to Israel. So I think, the model that I've had in mind is something like the terms by which Serbia was forced to leave Kosovo at the end of the NATO intervention. And the terms of that UN Security Council resolution was that Serbia withdraws all of its forces from Kosovo because it has lost the right to govern, because it has committed this terrible devastation. But at the same time, the rebel leadership of the Kosovo Albanians, the KLA, which Serbia viewed as terrorists, right? Even though I wouldn't compare them to Hamas for many reasons, but nevertheless, Serbia saw them as the big enemy. They also had to disarm, become demilitarized. And the international community decided they could not continue as a military fighting force, but their people had to reintegrate into, society and even to some extent governing and police institutions. And I think that's the only, and of all of that, with a massive international intervention, with a security piece and a governance piece aimed at transitioning within a number of years to self-governance, even though they couldn't resolve the political status, frankly, to this day. But I think that is at least a model to draw on, even if it's very far from something like copy-paste. There are no simple, let's just take this solution, but it does offer some principles.
Dahlia, that's a fantastic overview and some frightening thoughts there too. The Mogadishu scenario, I think also of Beirut possibly in the 1980s. I'd love to get some more questions, please. We've got a question coming up from Vaughan Grills, but please, everybody else, do put your questions in the Q&A box so you can put your questions directly to Dahlia. In a moment, also, we'll talk about the reactions from other Arab governments and what kind of commitment the United States and Europe are ready to give to Gaza if it were to create some kind of stability or political and economic stability there. Vaughan Grills, your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Dahlia, nice to see you again. You can't see me, but we last met in Tel Aviv about 18 months ago. And I've got a drawing of you here in front of me.
Yes, I remember.
And what I wanted to ask you was this. I'm delighted there has been a deal to release some of the Israelis from Hamas. But at the same time, I was quite taken aback that the trade seemed to be. I wondered why it was that Hamas' only trade was to have a pause in the fighting or ceasefire for that particular. I thought they would go for something much bigger. I mean, when you already mentioned the time an Israeli soldier was traded for over 1,000 1,000 Palestinians, which is extraordinary. I'm not saying that.
If I can chip in, doesn't this just point to a massive miscalculation, or whatever you think about how horrendous what they did? That their calculation was that they would get something for it. So isn't that
exactly
part of
exactly? Yeah. And what have they got for it? What are they getting for this?
No, they're getting prisoners released, right? They're getting that. This is the terms of the deal. They're getting a 4-day ceasefire, and they're getting Palestinian prisoners who are being held in Israel released. Not a huge number. It's not going to be 1,000. I think it's probably barely 100, if I understand correctly.
Exactly. So why? So where's the deal for them?
Oh, well, I mean, Gaza's being destroyed, right? And they are being weakened by the very punishing air campaign and now ground campaign. So, the question of, is this what Hamas expected and why didn't they demand more? Of course they demanded more, but they don't get to call all the shots. They called the shots, for the first 48 hours after October 7th, but Israel has its own leverage, and its most important leverage right now is simply sheer military force.
I thought they didn't care about Palestinian deaths. I mean, look at the way people were sent to their death by
I realize
blowing up themselves on buses and things
but the military campaign is not accomplishing nothing in terms of weakening Hamas. The military campaign isn't only, it is very hard to argue that it's not against civilians. Israel says it doesn't target civilians, but the level of damage is vast. However, that doesn't mean there are not military targets, right? Hamas has been significantly weakened by this. And, by most accounts, like I think Nick might have mentioned, Hamas is broadly understood to have miscalculated here. So I would never say that as an excuse, like, oh, they only thought they were going to be doing a minimal, limited amount of damage, and therefore they only imagined a limited response. I think that's a wrongful reading, but I do think the truth is somewhere in between. They certainly expected a serious response, but I don't think they counted on exactly how successful they were in their terms. and probably didn't expect a response quite like what they have now. So they certainly are, being weakened by what's going on. There have been some top people killed, not the top figures, but some of their military commanders, and of course, much of their infrastructure is being destroyed. So, yeah, I mean, to what extent do they care about the fact that the population is being? Listen, I mean, they don't have fuel, food, water, medicine. Right, except for the small amounts of humanitarian aid that have been allowed, and a very minimal amount of fuel that's been allowed even for the population. It's not enough, of course, but the terms of allowing fuel in, which happened just a few days ago, was that none of it reached Hamas. So the question is not only how much they're being weakened by the actual military actions, but also how much they're even able to operate. But what you're saying raises a different problem, which is that the Israeli criticism of this from many different sectors of society, including those parties that I said were opposed to the deal, is that Hamas can use those days, those however many they turn out to be. I think they're supposed to be 4, but they could, maybe go a little bit more. Is that they will use that to gather intelligence, to regroup, to find.
Exactly.
So all of that is possible, and they may think anything is helpful for their purposes. But especially, I think more than anything else, any prisoner release looks good for Hamas. And right now, if it's true that they miscalculated and that the response is even worse than they knew it would be, they knew it would be bad, but let's say it's even worse than they thought it would be. From their perspective, they have to cut their losses, and any prisoner release is, they're counting on that as their constant kind of pull a rabbit out of the hat and charm the Palestinian public, no matter how much people are suffering. Prisoner release is the currency.
I just thought that their whole. Because
I want to move on to other questions if we can, Vaughan. Just talking about other Middle Eastern governments, Qatar has obviously been key in helping negotiate the release of these hostages, and we know that Hamas leaders are both some of them in Qatar and some of them in Beirut. But if we talk what's more broadly been the response of Arab governments to this, and how can you see that developing?
Well, it's a little bit of a hard call. I mean, they've had to keep a somewhat low profile. Yes, there's not going to be any normalization, actively going on now. But I think that the other Arab countries, for one thing, Egypt has been also very active. There has been kind of a double channel of trying to deal with the hostage negotiations with Egypt and Qatar. And of course, Egypt is very directly affected by what happens in Gaza. So I think, the first, so let's say Saudi is kind of on pause. Mohammed bin Salman has been vocal at points, but it seems like he's trying to walk a cautious line between criticizing what Israel's doing and not completely burning its bridges, while at the same time not taking, personally a particularly active role here just yet. Saudi is also keeping its eyes very closely on what happens in Yemen, because Yemen is, of course, one of the proxy wars between Saudi and Iran. Iran and Saudi Arabia had recently had a kind of détente. They had begun to, revive relations that were frozen for a number of years. But now the Houthis in Yemen, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, have been firing missiles at Israel. And so there's sort of tense keeping an eye on the stability of this or instability of the situation there. But going back to Egypt, I think that Egypt, being the most directly affected by what happens here, has played a critical role, with that alternate channel for trying to negotiate a ceasefire or hostage deal, but also, Egypt has had to make a very clear decision about whether it will take Palestinian refugees or not. So far, Egypt has been extremely strict and completely rejected the idea of taking Palestinian refugees fleeing from Gaza. And that is controversial. But essentially, the Palestinians, on the one hand, are torn. Gazans, frankly, want to save their lives. And many of them do want to leave, although I think it's hard to tell with any certainty exactly what the quantitative measure would be. But we know just anecdotally that people, desperately want to leave and would like to go to, or have no other choice but to go through the Egyptian border at Rafah. Having said that, they also don't want to repeat, their historic memories of the Nakba in 1948, when they basically said, okay, we're going to flee the war just to save our lives, but then were never allowed back, lost their homes, livelihoods, society, etc. So they're wary about that as well. But from the Egyptian perspective, they don't want to let in a flood of people that may contain Hamas members. And specifically, they don't want those Hamas members to link up with the Muslim Brotherhood element in Egyptian society. They think that's destabilizing. Egypt is a very politically repressive society under essentially a military, somewhere between authoritarian and dictatorship. And Muslim Brotherhood is a competitor to the military rule, and they don't want to have that play into it. So Egypt is in a very sensitive role. But I will say there's something important to be said for the solidity of final status peace agreements. Both Egypt and Jordan have these peace agreements. Egypt's goes as far back to 1978 when it was signed, 1979 when it was implemented. Jordan's goes back to 1994. That's almost 30 years already. And what's remarkable is that even in this absolutely unprecedented time of duress and lots of very critical rhetoric, again, coming from, for example, King Abdullah of Jordan, those peace treaties have still held. These countries have not deteriorated and descended into renewed hostilities like in the early decades. And so that is the case so far. In terms of other countries, the Abraham Accord countries like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan is in a completely different case because Sudan has been so destabilized by its own civil war. But which, by the way, there's a whole interesting discussion there to be had about Israel's role there. But I think that's less of Sudan's concern right now because they're too wrapped up in their internal tragedy in a way. But UAE, I mean, honestly, I haven't heard that much coming from the UAE, and I think the reason is probably, if I read the Emirates properly, it's because they don't have a good relationship with the Palestinians. They have, frankly, an abysmal relationship with the Palestinians, and they don't really want to endanger this new relationship with Israel. So I think they're probably trying to keep a low profile. That's my speculation. And, with Qatar kind of taking the lead, it puts them in an odd position. They wanted to try to build up more influence in the Middle East, but Qatar is definitely coming out of this strong because they've now been responsible for negotiating this deal. So each country has a somewhat different set of interests. And Iran, of course, we're all keeping eyes on Iran, because the Hamas certainly expected that Hezbollah was going to join the fighting. We think that they're deeply disappointed that Hezbollah has not joined the fighting. And the Iranians have basically said, this is your own issue. So it's hard to know what to believe, but so far, all of those pieces are in the mix. Everybody's worried about regional escalation and grateful that it hasn't happened so far for reasons we can, discuss. But there is still the longer the fighting goes on, I think the more chance there is of regional escalation, which is another reason why any ceasefire is a good starting point. Okay,
another question now from Philip Godfrey this time. Go ahead, Philip.
Oh, hello, both Nicholas and Dahlia. Hi, I wondered if you could go back, Dahlia, to talk a little bit more about public opinion in Israel. My understanding is about 20% of the Israeli population are Arab Israelis. And I wondered if any polling had been done specifically targeted at that group, and in particular to understand what the sentiment is, or whether that sentiment about what's going on in Gaza has changed. Again, my understanding is there are no great supporters of Hamas, but as the destruction of Palestinian Gaza continues, is that sentiment changing? And if so, in a worrying direction, or is it stable?
Yeah, so here's what I have to say about that. I mean, the interesting thing is that I haven't seen any particularly, separate survey samples focusing just on the Arab population in Israel. They are about 20% of society. Having said that, because all survey research here includes full samples, I mean, not all, but most of the public surveys are full representative samples of the adult population. So they would include about 75-80% Jews and about 20% of the Arab who are Arab. And so when you look at those samples, they're taken by survey researchers who are asking questions of the general population. And so no survey researcher is going to ask, how much do you support Hamas, right? Because you wouldn't ask that of the general population. Nobody needs to know that kind of thing. It's obvious. I mean, maybe somebody will, but not yet. And so unless we see separate survey research that's targeted, as you pointed out, specifically to the Arab community here, I haven't seen those kinds of questions. But having said that, I can tell you a few other trends from the analysis of those samples that we've seen, again, in regular surveys. And I think, for example, one of the interesting things is that in these broader questions about, are you optimistic about the future of the state or the future of democracy in Israel, the general public, and especially the Jewish public, has shown a rise of optimism. I call it part of the rally round the flag effect. This is a known, impact of war on public opinion, and it's taking these forms in Israel with greater optimism for society. Among the Arab population, there's a question that has been asked routinely over the years: to what extent do you feel part of the state of Israel and its problems? Again, the Jewish population showed a rise. The Arab population showed a 22-point rise from just 6 months ago after October 7th. So on the one hand, there's also a kind of demonstrating a rally round the flag effect. But at the very same time, the other indicators have gone deeply down, where the Jewish population has shown a rise in optimism for the future of democracy and optimism for the future of the state. On those issues, the Arab population has gone significantly down. And that's a very strong indicator of what I think, which is that people are demonstrating that they feel part of the state and loyal, partly because they're facing some significant persecution by the Israeli authorities if they express any views that are out of line with the mainstream. There have been arrests, there's been investigations of people for writing, posts that are interpreted or misinterpreted to be supportive of Hamas, but mostly simply expressing solidarity with the people of Gaza has incurred these kinds of investigations or the authorities have sometimes arrested people or people losing their jobs. It's happened. So there's some sort of, I think, a desire for them to demonstrate, we are loyal, we're with the state, we're with the problems. Also because the Arab population also lost people, right? Some of there's dozens of kidnapped people who are kidnapped, who are Arab, and also people who are killed. So there's lots of, things going into that mix. But I think that there is a very significant sense of fear about the future and the present. And that's causing people to express more pessimism. I actually did just write an article about attitudes, not so much poll-based, because like I said, we only have a few kind of indicators. But I think on Sunday, this article appeared in my English column at Haaretz newspaper, showing how many Arabs are, kind of, in a way, it's not that they're supportive of Hamas, but one person said it to me very nicely. She said, we experience double pain. We are in pain for what happened in Israel, for themselves, people who knew victims, and of course among their Jewish friends, right? These societies are more integrated than ever before. Not that they're perfectly integrated and there's still lots of discrimination, but relative to the past, there's more integration of Arabs in general in Israeli life, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they feel part of that pain. And they are deeply connected to the people in Gaza, either through their own, social and family connections, or simply because they identify as part of the Palestinian community and because they see it on TV because they're watching Arabic news or Al Jazeera. And they feel devastated by that too, which is something most Israeli Jews don't feel. So they have both of these things going on. But I think that what happened on October 7th, in terms of Hamas itself, they were mostly revolted by the attack. That's what we've heard pretty much across the board. I mean, the Arab leadership in Israel, political figures within hours or days, but mostly within hours, condemned the attack and in very, passionate terms said this is like a violation of Islam for those who are Islamists, like Mansour Abbas, the head of the Islamic Movement Party in Israel. And the secular leaders also, they said it violates every human norm, and they were deeply pained about it. And that's the same thing I'm hearing from commentators and influential, other kind of community leadership figures in the Arab community. At the same time, they're very, very pained and critical of the all-out assault in Gaza. So I think that's a kind of qualitative understanding of what's going on, even in the absence of separate survey research on that community.
Dahlia, I want to come back to this Mogadishu idea or Beirut idea. For me, that presumes that the international community despairs of the problem. That's essentially what happened in Lebanon, 1982, Israel invasion, but the Americans and the French were involved, and eventually they pulled out. There's the bombing of the Marine barracks. And the mid-1980s were a terrible time for Lebanon. Do you really think that the international community and the Americans are really going to stand by as Gaza is left for years and with armed militias and just a sort of dissipating Palestinian society, Palestinians trying to leave and flee?
Well, it's not that so much I think that's what's going to happen. It's more that it is one of the scenarios, if you can imagine various factors falling into place. For example, I don't think the international community is going to back out of humanitarian aid. I think we already have, 80% of Palestinian services, a service provision in Gaza is essentially already run by the United States, the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, UNRWA, for decades already. That's not going to go away. And, whatever other international humanitarian agencies are there will continue to do that kind of service provision. So in that sense, the international community will be there. But if things get violent, they may have to, slowly and incrementally leave. And if there is let's say it seems right now that there's going to be a renewed international push for some sort of a peace process, whatever form that can possibly take right now. It certainly can't take anything right now, but maybe in the next, 6 months to a year. But that's no guarantee that such a process will succeed. For one thing, we still don't have a legitimate Palestinian leadership. It will take a while to get there. And so I don't think the international community as a whole, and we also have to distinguish what we mean by that. When we say international community, what we really often mean is Western powers and the powerful Western actors, the US, UK, France, Germany. We should really start thinking about the international community in a more inclusive way, to include all important international actors, well, except for those who cannot agree politically. But I don't think there's a plan for them to pull out. But the question is whether circumstances such as renewed violence making it impossible for the international humanitarian agencies to function in the long term, combined with some sort of a failure to get that peace process revived and off the ground and functioning, or a failure or a collapse once it does start, it could lead to, let's say, something like a stagnation on the part of the international community. And that's where I would be worried about the scenario of descending.
And that comes back to where there's no real agreement within Israel about what Israel wants. And if we're coming back to that point, you wrote a brilliant article for the New York Review of Books, which is essentially about the left. And when we talk about the left in Israel, we don't mean left, right in the same political sense that we do in most Western countries. We're really talking about the pro-peace camp, or people who believe in a peaceful solution with Palestinians, and those in Israel who believe there isn't one. So what has been the impact for those who do advocate a peaceful solution? And then I'll come back to questions about what the government wants in the long term, which is we're coming back to the same question we asked in the beginning.
Yeah, well, it's like, as I tried to point out in the article, it's a tough call, because in many ways the left was going through what everybody's going through, which is severe trauma of experiencing October 7th, and in some ways worse than the regular public, because many of the people in those southern kibbutz communities were left wing. Many of them were activists, many of them were peace or human rights activists, many of them had good relations with Gaza, and one of the most famous and tragic cases, somebody I know personally, like everybody in the activist community, was Vivian Silver. She lived in Kibbutz Be'eri, and she was very active in, for example, picking Palestinians up from Gaza who needed medical treatment in Israel and driving them to their medical treatment. And these are the kinds of people that, again, it's a very small community, because there aren't very many left-wingers in general in the sense that you correctly described. And those who are active, who are showing up to every peace protest or active in human rights organizations, are even fewer. So the left was like personally traumatized in certain ways. And then I think also ideologically traumatized. Some people were saying, oh my God, it's really hard to maintain this dispassionate sense that, it's only this bad leadership and it's not all Palestinians who are responsible for this kind of thing. The kinds of things that the left has embraced over the years and tried to convince all of Israeli society to agree with, to little success. But I think that what happened on October 7th was so, deranged that it caused a lot of people to, it caused some people to question their own beliefs. And those who maintain their commitment to the idea that only a political resolution that allows Palestinian self-determination can contain the kinds of conflict that we have here, those people who've maintained those commitments, I think, feel very alone. They feel like there's definitely going to be a backlash from Israeli society, because many people in Israeli society, most people, right, are defined either as right-wing or centrist. And centrists are an interesting group themselves, but everybody's in a sort of a mode of sweeping patriotism, and nobody really wants to hear about things like land concessions for peace. It sounds completely, out of sync with the reality on the ground. So I think the left feels more alone than ever in Israel. And then, it's impossible to leave aside the devastating impact of what many see as a complete betrayal of, liberal left-wing communities. I can't even call them liberal. I don't think there's anything liberal about somehow justifying what happened on October 7th. But, to hear people who many thought were their allies in supporting, the universal principles of human rights and protection of civilians. And
they're talking about protest groups outside Israel, and who are basically more not failing to condemn Hamas, or
either failing to condemn or openly justifying, or in many cases, a subtle kind of denial, downplaying or doubting what actually happened. All of those things were extremely painful for people who, for many years, felt so isolated in Israeli society that they really, depended on those partnerships to help them amplify, the value system of trying to change American policy, to help support, getting back to negotiations and political resolution to the conflict. I mean, and I'm going to be, open disclosure here, I completely am part of that community. We viewed the international allies as critical allies in this, in this general long-term struggle to get back to peaceful resolution of the conflict. So to see some of those allies, and I don't want to paint them all in the same basket, because I think there are numerous kind of peace activists or liberal left-wing supporters abroad who absolutely have an understanding of just what happened on October 7th and why it can't be justified in any way. But those who took a different perspective, and I think that the sin of downplaying, denial, and doubting is in a way no better than actively marching in support of Hamas, which, I think there is a distinction between marching in support of Palestinian rights. Free Palestine is not a crime in my mind, but denying the atrocities is a crime. And so, all of these things got conflated. I think many people here felt very abandoned by those allies abroad who couldn't make that distinction, and felt that in order to save Free Palestine, they also had to deny what Hamas did. Frankly, it was unconscionable and extremely and damaging. And so the left is operating very much on it. But I think that, honestly, that described the first phase. I think we're in a slightly different phase now. I think that abroad, allies are kind of figuring out, what is the more appropriate response to this, or at least the partnerships that were strong to begin with. Now people have identified who really is a kind of partner with some sort of a moral integrity around this. And inside Israeli society, I think the left-wing activists are starting to come to more understanding about what they agree on. In the beginning, everybody was so confused and traumatized, it wasn't even clear, but I think there's more of a clear, unified position in support of a ceasefire now. Of course, everybody agrees about wanting to free the hostages, because, especially civilians, but I think that there is a clear commitment. One more thing, a clear commitment to Jewish-Arab partnership inside Israel, which is what I wrote about just a couple of days ago.
Yeah. But at the same time, it would seem to me that Israel and the government is immune from international criticism. You've got 14,000 dead. You yourself have written about how Israel has deliberately gone about to undermine, valid critics of Israel, whether it's legal groups, human rights groups, and so the pressure on Israel is muted. We've got 14,000 dead, many more, may follow, and it seems nothing can stop Israel. I've got a question. There's a question here that fits with that from Richard Murphy as well. Go ahead, Richard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question, I suppose, is what the Israeli public opinion actually, and your own opinion about public opinion then across the rest of the world. And I think it's not so much activists, and the bit you've talked there about people who were engaged, at least in some way, but for those who just had very little knowledge, I think there was an initial absolute horror at this unprovoked terrorist attack that clearly attacked so many innocent people. But actually, I can say, just talking about, my personal trainer, people like that, they're just looking at 14,000 then dying in Gaza, including so many children, and so obviously horrendous. And it brings two things. One, it's they start comparing numbers and saying 1,400, 14,000, well, hold on. How do I morally have to support what Israel is doing? And then, so finding out more about the history, and that word of, it was so promoted as an unprovoked attack. Actually, even if you cannot justify it, people are just, genuinely people on the street are struggling to justify to themselves criticizing Hamas or anyone who's had the experience of the last 10, 15, 20, however many years in Gaza.
I would go further back. I mean, Palestinians under occupation for, they've never had self-determination, put it that way. I think it's, to be completely historically accurate, since 1948, Palestinian, life and society was basically destroyed and scattered. For the first 20 years, Israel held Palestinians in Israel under military occupation, but then ended the military regime over its citizens in late 1966, in practice only in 1968. But then it conquered the territories of West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in 1967. So let's say there's always been some Palestinian population under a military rule. And the question is where? It's true that for Palestinians, citizens of Israel, They are no longer living under occupation. And the Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem were not under Israeli occupation before 1967. But from 1948, there's still never been Palestinian self-determination. And for the last 56 years, they've been living under some form of military rule or ultimate control. And so, yeah, and then, of course, it all got severely worse for Gazans in 2005. I mean, there have been many points in which these mechanisms became worse for Palestinians. But from 2005 onward, it became, or 2005 and then 2007 is when Israel has been imposing an extremely severe form of closure over Gaza, controlling it, basically shut down all the land, sea, and air crossings that it controls, which is everything except for the Egyptian border. Even that, it coordinates with Egypt, and Egypt has mostly kept that closed. Everything that goes in or out is severely restricted in terms of import, export, and all goods. And in terms of the movement of people, it's been severely restricted over time. So of course, these are, terrible circumstances, and we should never have expected them to continue peacefully. There was never a peaceful phase. I mean, anybody who thinks that Israel was not experiencing conflict before this, or the Palestinians, hasn't been following. And so, in response to your question about how to look at this, I guess is what I would characterize it as. Of course, every conflict that is not resolved politically will eventually explode into violence. It still doesn't justify attacks on civilians, and the attacks on civilians cannot justify another attack on civilians. I mean, I hate to be both-siderism about it, but the only thing we have to go on that makes some objective sense is international law, and that's how I would look at it.
Yeah, I guess my point was to say that whatever we think of it, it seems that there's nothing that can stop Israel.
No, that's not. Yeah, that's not true.
I mean, against Israel,
public
but the sheer
opinion
numbers of dead and dying, it just doesn't seem there's nothing holding it back.
No, public opinion in itself will not hold Israel back, but countries have leverage, and for the most part, they have simply not been willing to use it. So there are certainly things that America can do to wield much more material leverage over Israel. Primarily the U.S. If it had the partnership of the European allies, that would help. But the U.S. can do it alone too, and they just won't do it, right? So if the U.S. were to signal that it's withholding aid or withdrawing its the aircraft carrier groups that it's sent to the region, these would be enormous game changers. And eventually, I assume the Americans will, at least pull back the aircraft carriers, but. Right now, that was seen as a major factor helping to prevent regional escalation. I think it worked, and I think it was the right thing. But my point is that America has some significant steps it can take. Remember that America is sending over, before this, America was sending over $3.8 billion of aid a year for military aid. Never mind that it passed an enormous, additional package to help support this war. So those are the kinds of things that where America does have leverage, very significant leverage, but it won't use it. And if that were to ever change, it would certainly change the equation. And we may have to get to that. Now, maybe there's incremental steps that America can take to get there. But, just one quick example of how that can work is that when the Prime Minister announced that, or his defense minister, I guess, announced on Friday last week that Israel was going to start allowing a very limited amount of fuel to get to Gaza, which is absolutely critical. I mean, the Prime Minister, it was the Prime Minister. He specifically cited that that the war must be fought by Israel's military capacity, but Israel needs also political and diplomatic support in order to fight this war, and that was being threatened by Israel's continuing refusal to allow any fuel and with it the humanitarian aid that is needed. And so that was the Prime Minister actually cited that as one of the justifications for allowing fuel to come in, after he had said in the beginning, no fuel, never, no fuel, and he took some political criticism for it. But of course, and he himself made the argument that Israel needs international backing, which means that if international support was withdrawn from those key allies, of course they could have leverage, just usually they haven't wanted to use it.
Dahlia, there we must leave it. Thank you very much. It's been an enormous discussion. I'm now again looking at my face, speaking more slowly than my words, but there we go. But you've done a fantastic job. Domestic opinion in Israel, the possible future in Gaza, the political realities for the Palestinians, as well as the positions of countries across the Middle East. A very thorough explanation of things. Thank you very much indeed for your time.